Welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Brian Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at brianmurdoch.com. Today we're speaking about a writer that some of you will never have heard of. Norman Lewis was the 20th century's most underrated writer about place. He had an instinct for being in exactly the right place to capture traditional ways of life on the brink of modernity. But his books are far from dry. He also had an unerring eye for the absurd. His life was just as fascinating as the worlds he brought to life in his books. Before he was able to live from his journalism and novels, he earned money as an umbrella wholesaler, a race car driver, and the founder of one of London's first camera shops, which grew into a chain with outlets in several cities, and that gave him the money to fund his trips. He served in the intelligence corps in the Second World War, and he was sent on spying missions to Cuba by the creator of James Bond. He lived the sort of life that seems lost to us today, and he remains one of my favorite writers on place. Lewis's biographer Julian Evans joined me to talk about his life and work. Julian's the author of Semi-Invisible Man, The Life of Norman Lewis, and of Transit of Venus, about his own travels in the Pacific. We spoke about Lewis's escape reflex, the subjectivity of witness statements, and the past as a place. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. Julian Evans, welcome to Personal Landscapes.
Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
This is an episode I've wanted to do since I started the podcast, and I'm really glad to have you here. I absolutely loved your biography, by the way. It's easily in my top 3, up there alongside Martha Gellhorn by Caroline Moorhead and McNiven's bio of Lawrence Durrell. I mean, this was such a fantastic read, and we'll only be able to scratch the surface of this man's life. So some of my listeners may not be familiar with Norman Lewis or his work. So who was he and how did you meet him?
Norman was really the best not famous writer of his generation, I think. He was born pretty much at the beginning of the century, and he died at the very beginning of the 21st century. So he died when he was 95. But he spanned a century, the 20th century, which I think we admit was one of the most eventful in human history. And he had some say the enormous good fortune to witness an enormous amount of that. But Norman had a knack of perceiving and sort of pre-perceiving things that were going to happen. So when he wanted to escape from his very boring, dull childhood in Enfield in North London, an endless suburb, one of the endless North London suburbs, he went to Spain. But he not only went to Spain, he found himself in the middle of the Asturian miners' strike, which precursed the Spanish Civil War. And that was really the beginning of everything. He was then in Vietnam just before the French were forced to leave. He was in Burma just before it was taken over. He wrote the first really in-depth book about the Sicilian mafia in the 1950s. He just was so on the spot because, for one thing, he was very interested in world events, and for another, he was a fantastically restless and footloose person who was always looking for the next story.
And how did you meet him?
I met him. I class it as one of the luckiest experiences of my life, that I happened to be working as a junior editor. The first sort of 10 years of my career, I worked as a publisher's editor, and I was a junior editor to an extremely good publisher called Christopher Sinclair Stevenson at Hamish Hamilton. Hamish Hamilton was an independent publisher who had published great writers from Sartre to James Thurber and Camus. And Christopher Sinclair Stevenson had a very good eye for not only finding new talent, people like William Boyd and Peter Ackroyd, but also for spotting people who had as it were, fallen by the wayside. And Norman's reputation, having been pretty high in the 50s and 60s, had his star had waned a little bit and faded. And Christopher spotted that he was writing a new book, which turned into an absolutely marvelous book called Voices of the Old Sea, about his own life in Spain. It was a sort of travel memoir of Spain. And because Christopher was an incredibly generous man, he said, "Julian, I want you to edit Norman's book." And so I had lunch with Norman and my boss, and I came across this incredibly wary and suspicious and therefore almost speechless person in a restaurant in Covent Garden. It made for a very awkward first 20 minutes of lunch. And then he suddenly decided we could be trusted. And the stories began to pour out of him. And thereafter, as his editor, it sort of transformed into, I think, a father-son relationship in a way. He was in his own sort of silent and really quite unavailable emotionally. But in that kind of way, he was nevertheless a man whose warmth you could feel. So we developed over the years that I was editing him. And even when he moved publishers and I left publishing, we had this very sort of understood relationship, which was never explicit, but I felt his warmth and his generosity very strongly.
You write that he was self-invented, that he had no mentors, no tracks of middle-class privilege to follow, no Oxford or Cambridge or country house upbringing to ease his way, unlike most every writer who would become his contemporary. So how unusual was that at the time?
I think it was very unusual. I mean, when Norman started writing in the 30s, people like Patrick Leigh Fermor, Robert Byron, Peter Fleming, those were the princes of the art of travel writing, if you like, between the wars. And, you know, they were aristocratic or semi-aristocratic. They'd been to Cambridge or Oxford. It was very much that kind of world. Norman was a pharmacist's son from Enfield, didn't go to university. He was a bit of a wide boy, sold umbrellas, sold cameras. But again, there he had great taste. He was the first, I think, importer of any size of the new Leica portable 35mm camera, and his photographic shots in Holborn and then across the country, R.G. Lewis, named after his father, were absolute destinations of choice for any 35mm camera enthusiast. And that's how he financed his early travels.
So do you think that that's having no connections of that sort that contributed to his resourcefulness? Like, he had to find a way that these others didn't to fund these things. And he had some astonishing range of jobs. I mean, he was racing cars at one point too, wasn't he?
Oh, yes. And there again, you know what I'm going to say, you know, the quality came through. What cars did he race? Bugattis. He was one of the first people who understood the grace and beauty of these, and speed, obviously, of these motor cars. Yes, and he I think he was in the last race at Brooklands before the Second World War. It was a disaster. You know, he spun off and very nearly had a bad accident. But yes, that's what he was doing. He loved cars. In fact, he loved cars up until the 1960s. He would go to the motor show every year, and he sold a piece about the mafia to the New Yorker, and immediately went to the motor show, and I think bought a Pontiac that was too long for his garage, and had to build a new garage. But I think then it was probably, you know, he sort of realized that he'd reached peak automobile at that point, and his enthusiasm dropped away. But I mean, in a funny way, it's a really good question, because he was very resourceful, and he dived into all sorts of activities. But whatever he touched was always to do with, somehow, you know, he went for the greatest quality. There was a point in his life as he had a sort of dandyish period, and he bought his suits from Savile Row, up until a few years. I mean, they weren't worn for many, many years, but they were beautiful suits. I did once see his wardrobe.
So, what do you think that gave his this lack of a traditional education gave to his writing that the others didn't have?
That's the self-invented bit. I think his education was he was very much the autodidact. He taught himself to read and to appreciate good writing. When I say he taught himself to read, he taught himself to read the good guys. So he read all of Shakespeare. He read the Bible front to back 2 or 3 times, he claimed, and I'm pretty sure it's true, because there is something both very spare and lyrical at the same time in his writing, which comes from those sort of terse Attic Bible sentences, actually. And he once said he thought very little of modern stylists, and so his own style, which was a style of description. I'll talk about that in a second, but it was a style of description that was based on being himself as invisible as possible in the text, and yet you knew he was there. So what he was doing was he was channeling whatever he was describing, and you were receiving it, as if somebody had put, I think Luigi Barzini, the Italian writer, once described this as, it was like eating cherries one after another, and it was as if Norman just put this bowl of cherries in front of you, and you had direct access to them from his prose.
That's very interesting. An interesting observation too, because there is something timeless about his writing. It doesn't fit any sort of current trends or whatever. You said also that he plunged into the Russian classics. He claimed to have read a classic a day, or 4 days for War and Peace. At the end of it, he had read something like 100 of these books, courtesy of a library that he had access to, and then started again and read them over again. So what did the Russian classics bring, do you think, to his style?
I think there was a very strong narrative thread in his writing, and I think that's what he got from Tolstoy and Chekhov. He was very fond of Chekhov, and a love for ordinary people. I mean, Chekhov made it very clear to anybody who asked him about his writing that what he was interested in was how people eat and sleep and breathe. These are ordinary people. These are sort of woodcutters and villagers and serfs, peasants. And those are the kind of people Norman was interested in. Also, the people who belonged to the places where they lived. Norman wasn't interested in anybody else. He wanted to find the people who belonged in the places where they lived.
Yeah, that's a theme that I want to come to in a second too, but it just made me think when you said this that I wonder if he was so interested in ordinary people because his own background was so completely out of the ordinary. I mean, he came from a pretty bizarre family.
Yes, that's a really interesting question, because on the one hand, there was Enfield, soulless, dull. Well, he once described an Enfield Saturday night as nothing with chips. And I think on the one hand, you could describe his life in Enfield up until his late teens, perhaps very early 20s, as being very dull. But on the other hand, he could make it come alive, and he could turn Enfield into a place in which perhaps not everything could happen, but certainly he could paint Enfield as vividly as he could paint Naples or Guatemala. He always denied that. He always said it was really, really almost impossible for him to write about England. Up to a point, he's right, because he didn't write very much about England and Wales, of course, where he was exiled as a child after being bullied at his school in Enfield.
I mean, it's such a remarkable cast of characters to work with as well. These mad aunts in Wales that he lived with, and then his parents becoming spiritualists and hosting seances and things like this. It's just amazing stories.
Yes, that gives me the opportunity to say a little bit about his growing up, because he had 2 brothers who both died. And he had an older brother, Monty, who he was especially fond of, who died, this was the 1910s, so the medicine was not terribly advanced. He had a kidney infection and just died. And so Norman grew up as an only child with 2 parents who were pretty much beside themselves with grief. And when spiritualism came along in the wake of the First World War, there was this sudden grasping at straws, and the seances began in the Lewis household. And his parents' enthusiasm for spiritualism became so great that they actually had a spiritualist chapel built in their garden. So there were his parents trying to make the table move, and there was Norman almost sort of crawling under the table to try and get away from this horribly embarrassing situation he found himself in.
So you spoke about his restlessness and this need to get away from this place. Tell me about what you called his escape reflex.
He was obviously involved in the Second World War. He was born in 1908, so he was quite old when the war began, but he nevertheless got himself into the intelligence corps, and as an NCO, non-commissioned officer. He was a corporal and then a sergeant. He was in something called field security. He was in North Africa, and his duties in North Africa were occasional, and they allowed him a lot of leeway. So he would often find himself in odd situations, being invited to dinner by local businessmen who wanted to curry favor with the occupying allies, or he would go out into the desert on his motorbike to visit local Berber clans and tribal chiefs. And then, of course, he went to Naples and spent a year in liberated/occupied Naples after the Allies drove the Germans out. And when he came back from the war, he always said that it was a terrible thing to say, but it had been one of the most extraordinary and fascinating periods of his life. And I think that is the point, certainly the point I identified in the book, where I think his life sort of broke in two halves. And there was the pre-war period when he really wanted to get out of Enfield. You know, he's a young man. He had a taste to find life more interesting than the North London suburbs. And so he did a couple of trips, very interesting trips. One to Spain and one to Aden and the Yemen. But then after the war, when he realized that he could write about the places he'd gone to, he had a little bit of success before the war, but he had the war crystallized his writing, and it also crystallized this escape reflex, I think. And it meant that he came back, and like a lot of men, found it very difficult to adjust to peacetime life because the war had been very exciting. And then instead of shrugging and just knuckling down and getting a job and, running his camera shops, he said, no, I can make this work for me, and I'm just going to travel. And he would go away, he would come back, and by then he had a flat in Orchard Street in London's West End, now next to Selfridges, and would stay there for a little while. And you might think, well, that's a very pleasant way to live. But he would just get very restless and he would have to go again. And he had the resources to do it because his camera business had by then expanded to, I think, 6 shops. And so the money was coming in and he could finance these trips. Plus he was being published.
You've got a really good quote in your book here about that, how the war shaped his future journeys. You say, the intense pleasure of his war years became the banner and device of his post-war adventures, the reality that he was always seeking to recreate. So in the exhausted domestic peace of mid-1945, all his problems, literary and personal, would begin to reduce to one problem: how to retain the happiness of war.
I just had to find a way there of just really pinning the war on him, or really pinning him to the war, because I do think it was the formative experience of his life. And that's not just me saying that, that's various things he said to me also over the years.
Yeah, speaking of which, you've got a quote here from him. He said, "The war was something fantastic. I hate cruelty of any kind. I'm a passionate person, but every minute of the war, all the time I was abroad, was absolutely paradise."
That's absolutely right. And I mean, it wasn't without its dangers, but what it brought with it was this this idea that every day something new would happen. And that was something that also really informed and determined the kind of journeys he made. So, for example, I said to him once, "What's the most boring place you've been to, Norman?" And he said, "California, without a doubt." And I said, "Well, why is that?" He said, "Well, I could go to California and I could find that I would wake up every morning and know that nothing new or surprising was going to happen that day." Beautiful. Beautiful, and I mean, this is the sort of acme of the place that plenty of people want to go. Oh, I want to go, California, go and live in LA. And there's Norman saying, "No, take me away from all this. I want to go to a tiny village somewhere in Venezuela or somewhere in Guatemala. I'd be much happier there with the people who belong there."
Yeah, this is something that you talk about that was present right from his earliest book on Spain. You say that the justification for the journey was that very soon irrevocable change might make it impossible to see these things as they were now. To play devil's advocate on that for a minute, I agree with this, but hasn't it always been like that? Like, I remember Dervla Murphy talking about her stories of traveling through Ethiopia right before the arrival of the motor car and Western consumer goods. And she told me that even at the time, she knew the world she was seeing was about to vanish forever. It seems to be a common traveler's trope, but in his case, I mean, this really was true.
Yes, I think that's right. Didn't Evelyn Waugh write a book called When the Going Was Good? Norman, of course, there you are, Evelyn Waugh, another of the semi-aristocratic travellers of that period. Norman, of course, was in a similar vein, trying to find the things he could see before they changed. But I think what you say is absolutely true from the point of view of everywhere, everything, always being on the point of change.
Well, you quote a friend of his from Rangoon who said that Norman saw the romance going out of the world, that we're the last generation to be able to see strange cultures in their unspoiled condition. The world's modernizing, Americanizing, and the enchantment is being squeezed out. But I remember thinking the same thing when travel changed from sort of the pre-internet to the internet and smartphone era. It really was so cut off before. You could drop off the map back then. And it seems to me the current travelers are missing so much, like this vapid age of Instagram travel, with this deluge of identical selfies and people all posting the same pictures with the same filters and couples who pose in exactly the same places with the girl in the summer dress, and the bro in his straw trilby. And it's just, there was something different. The past was a totally different place. So even in our time, I think those of us who started traveling, before this happened, it was an entirely different world. So even more so for a man like Lewis.
Yeah, I think that's right. I remember sitting in an Indian restaurant in London, talking to a friend of mine who was heading for India, and I'm afraid I berated her for saying that she got her Sony Walkman packed, and her playlist of cassette tapes packed, and I said, no, you have to leave all that behind. And when you compare that kind of argument with, I mean, let's not be a couple of oldsters sort of saying that the young aren't doing it properly. But when you've got one sort of travel against your interesting, I like the quote, the vapid age of Instagram travel, I think something's been lost. But unless you knew what was there before, you didn't know that. So you can't know that it was lost. But when I, for instance, spent 5 months in the Pacific, traveling before I wrote my first book, the only way of staying in contact with people back in England was to write a letter, and then in the letter say, please send any reply to the poste restante, the post office, in the next island or the next island but one that I'm going to. And I think I didn't speak to any of my friends for 5 months. And that was Norman's existence too, because he was totally pre that era.
I don't think we're being a couple oldsters either about pointing this out, because it's not that younger travelers aren't aren't trying to do these things, maybe, or perhaps that they don't know about them. But it's something that I noted down a bit later on that you observed in your book. You described his interest in places that are not subject to civilization's bureaucracies, to the dull organizing frameworks that make life orderly, predictable, and secure. And for Lewis and for guys like us, dull. So these places are robbed of the potential to surprise. And I think the smartphone sort of extends that to everywhere, that dull bureaucracy, because you don't just turn up in a village and you don't know where you're going to stay, or with a guidebook that's, 10 years out of date and may or may not, these places may not. I remember going to places in Tibet where the whole town had been bulldozed and like nothing in the book, not even the maps made sense anymore. You don't have that experience if this device in your pocket tells you exactly what to expect around the next corner, right from where you're going to be posing for your photos. So it's not that, I don't know that it's the travelers who are failing in that sense, but this horrible bureaucracy and this tyranny of technology has crept into every corner of the world, it seems.
Putting both those words, bureaucracy and technology, into the same sentence indicates a kind of, it's a sort of portmanteau malaise, if you like, because when I was traveling in Europe, I was working as a journalist, doing quite a lot of journalism in the 1990s, which is sort of pre-internet. And by chance, I stumbled on Ukraine. I'd been asked by a French magazine to write a piece about a river trip, and a river trip from Kiev to the Black Sea down to Yalta. And that was 10, 12 days of discovering Ukraine, and I ended up in Odessa. Now, Ukraine was a charming, unknown country. I think it was unknown to almost everybody until February last year. But what entranced me about Ukraine was there was very little technology because it was a poor Eastern European or Central European country in which things only just worked. But also, once you got your visa and you were there, because things only just worked, everything was improvised. And when you improvise, and when things aren't sort of everything isn't bureaucratically laid out for you, surprising things can happen. Surprising, interesting, funny, sometimes dramatic things can happen. And I think that's what made me fall in love with Ukraine. And of course, now very dramatic things are happening in Ukraine. But that characteristic, funnily enough, I think is connected to the resourcefulness of the Ukrainians now in their opposition to the Russian invasion. And so I do worry that what you describe as bureaucracy and technology combined leads us to become rather more passive consumers and residents of the world than we once were when all these things weren't mapped out for us and predicted for us.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And this new Europe that we find ourselves in right now was also a world that Lewis maybe foresaw in his very first book, or at least perhaps it mirrors the times that he was living in. He said, "It merely was and still is my private opinion that if you want to see the world, now is the time. There are omnipresent signs of a wrath to come, embracing the possibility, at least, of a return to the Dark Ages. In such a case, the only travelers will be refugees, and the Hegira is likely to supersede the pleasure cruise." And that could just as easily be today. That's such an important message, I think, for everybody. Every traveler and everybody listening to this is now is the time. If you want to go to a place, don't wait.
That is so interesting, that early quote, because I remember him saying something similar, or rather, I remember Don McCullum saying something similar that Norman said to him when he and Don McCullum, the photographer, the great photographer, when they started traveling in the late 60s. Yes, absolutely spot on that we've arrived at that point now. There are, ways to, if you like, reverse this trend, and there are ways to sort of skirt around it and still enjoy the world. But I think the resourcefulness that is required of us now to reject, if you like, the pre-programmed, pre-packaged world that we're being sold, everything social media to the ease of jet travel. You can do that, but the resourcefulness is required is going to be is going to be great. I mean, I was in Ukraine in November and December for 3 weeks. I was living in Odessa, and we were being occasionally bombed. But I had a very nice hotel. Hotel rates had gone through the floor because obviously there are no tourists there. I had the most fascinating 3 weeks I could possibly have had, surviving and meeting new people and going into villages and helping with some aid distributions. And, that's obviously not everybody's idea of a holiday, but I can tell you that it's the most fascinating thing to do and the most fascinating way to travel if you've got a reasonable tolerance of risk.
You talk about finding such communities in places sort of at the edges of the map or places that are in strife. It makes me think of something you said about Lewis's escape reflex. You said that it was counterbalanced in a sense with what you referred to as his antinomic belief system. In part, he was motivated by his own escape, but then he also was attracted to the sense of belonging in traditional cultures. Could you say a bit about that? Like this drive to get away, but at the same time, this yearning for the sort of belonging that he saw in traditional places that he feels maybe were lost in his own culture.
Yes, I think he did feel that. I think from his childhood onwards, where he was an outsider, he was very badly bullied at school for being intelligent, and into his adult life when he was really seriously bitten by the travel bug. He wanted to find places where he could belong for a little while. He was never the kind of person, though, who could be at home in any one place. So he went to very far-flung places. He went to places we know. He went to Spain. He went to Guatemala. Everybody goes to Guatemala these days. Students on their gap year go to Guatemala. He went to Irian Jaya, very far-flung place. I went there first, by the way. But I lent him all my books, and he was very interested about it. And he made a fantastic Channel 4 documentary about it. He was really, really fascinated by the places where people belonged. India, too. He didn't go to the normal places in India. He went to the tribal parts of India because those are the places where there was the least population movement. The people who lived there had always lived there. And he really liked those kinds of communities. But if Norman hadn't been born in Enfield, is, I think, quite a good parlour game to play, because I think the answer would have to be Italy. He said that, if I could have chosen to be born in any particular place, I would have chosen Italy.
Was that because of his experiences in Naples?
Yes, that's where it started very much. Afterwards, when he had a family, he actually took the family to Italy to live in a part of a castle just outside Rome. And he was thinking of settling the family in Italy and having a go at living there. But after 6 months, he realized that even Italy wasn't going to be a place where he could settle down. But it was perhaps the closest he ever got to finding an ideal place where he could settle. Having said that, for a writer, he had a beautiful house, which he bought relatively cheaply after in the 50s, and in Essex, which is a place no one ever goes to. So he had all the calm in the world. Sorry to the people of Essex. There are some very beautiful parts of Essex, but it's particularly badly served by public transport, by rail links, and even the people in Essex would admit that. But what it gave Norman was a fantastic sense of calm. So when he came back to his wonderful wife, Leslie, who is still with us, by the way, still a great traveller herself. I've just come back from 5 days in Portugal with her. But when he came back to Finchley Field and the parsonage where he lived and had a beautiful garden, he was very, very keen gardener, and his garden was full of wonderful things, many of which he brought back from his travels. He could then write there because there was complete calm. So, if you like, what he did, instead of just settling and being a calm, contented person settled in one place, was he found the ingredients for a life that interested him. And some of it was settled and some of it was very restless.
I want to talk a bit about his writing style as well. At many points in the biography, you come back to Kurosawa's Rashomon and the way the film interrogates the impact of subjectivity on recollection and the infinite variety of eyewitness testimonies. Why was this important to Lewis, and why is it important to understanding him as a writer?
Because I think he became utterly convinced that there is no such thing as objective truth, or there's no such thing as objective eyewitness reality, which is what Rashomon is all about. Thereafter, I think that gave him the license to write in the way that he did, to produce his version of the world, or his version of reality in whichever part of the world he was. In fact, one of his collections of journalism is called A View of the World. That's what you get with Norman. You get, I think, what you can really call his own personal celebration of the world and his recreation of it in words. And this is what I mean. He's a very, very pictorial writer. And one of the reasons I think we still really respond to him now is because whenever you read him, you see what he sees. He has this extraordinary ability. The other reason is because he's like Scheherazade. He tells another new story every night. That's why I think he's going to still be read in 100 years' time.
We should read a couple little snippets of his descriptions. I don't want to give the sense that his writing is at all dry. I mean, he's such a great sense of the absurd, and as you said, this great pictorial way of writing. I have to try to decipher my own scribblings from my notebook here. These are just things I wrote down as I was reading him. I think this is from the Burma book, Golden Earth. Like he describes a van full of people. The transport in Burma, for those who haven't been there, is often private trucks that people are just crammed into, for long journeys over horrible roads. And very much like what he wrote about, it hasn't really changed that much, at least 20 years ago when I traveled there. But he talks about the post wagon discharged its passengers like seeds exploded from an overripe pod. And in another place, he talks about these people he would meet who would speak in sort of inherited cliches that they'd gotten from watching too many movies. Cinema argot ran like a rich vein of fool's gold through their speech. It's just such a perfect image, fool's gold,
Yes.
To give a sense of the absurd here, this is a slightly longer bit, but do you remember there's a scene where he's, I think he's in Pinolin, which is the Maymyo, the British hill town. And he wanted to get a lift to another town, and there was a lorry that was leaving, but he had just missed it or something. So a Jeep driver picked him up, and they were determined to catch this thing. But describing the Jeep, he said, "My driver was handicapped by a mysterious ailment of the Jeep, a dysfunction which I've never met before or since. We would accelerate, sometimes to nearly 50 miles an hour, and then suddenly the car would be seized by a violent convulsion, whose epicenter seemed vaguely located in the gearbox. Once in the grip of this palsy, the driver would be obliged to bring the Jeep practically to a standstill before the tremors died away and we could accelerate once again." It's just great stuff. It's such a joy to read.
Yeah, and what you notice in those descriptions, particularly the first and the last one, for example, the overripe seed pod, is that actually it's very pictorial. And there's an element of cartoonishness about it. So it's almost hyper real. P.G. Wodehouse, Raymond Chandler, anybody who can come up with really successful, unusual similes has got a good chance of keeping the reader's attention. But what Norman did was he injected this little bit of cartoonish humor, which not only made you see things, but it made you laugh at them at the same time, as you were when you were reading.
If I remember right, either from your book or from something he had written, that he developed this eye during the wartime and writing about Naples or the post-war period in Naples, because you kind of had to write about the absurd or notice the absurd to cope with just the absolute misery that these people were living in. Like there's this scene in a restaurant. He goes with this sort of disheveled, poverty-stricken aristocrat, and they have the fish. They show the fish around to the tables, to diners, and but the head was of one fish and the body was of another much cheaper fish. So they would just try to pull a bait and switch.
Yeah.
And then at the end, he said something about we opted for chicken or something. Yeah, catching the absurdity of these scenes within misery was really interesting.
This is not to say that he was just an Englishman chuckling at funny foreigners, because there's another scene in Naples 44 in a restaurant.
It's the same scene. This comes immediately after.
Yes, there's a scene immediately after that in Naples 44 where a group of girls are led in to the restaurant and they sit down, and it's a while before he realizes that they are all blind. This is just such a horrible, tragic thing that he describes just in a couple of sentences, but it's like a gut punch. And, it just reminds you that he was as good at portraying without leaning on it. He was as good at portraying unhappiness, wretchedness, despair, tragedy, as he was at the funny things and the absurd things.
I photocopied that description and kept it in a. It's such a beautiful ending to a chapter.
Shall I read it to you?
Yes, yeah, please.
I expected the indifferent diners to push back their plates, to get up and hold out their arms, but nobody moved. Forkfuls of food were thrust into open mouths. The rattle of conversation continued. Nobody saw the tears. Until now, I'd clung to the comforting belief that human beings eventually come to terms with pain and sorrow. Now I understood I was wrong, and like Paul, I suffered a conversion, but to pessimism. These little girls, any one of whom could be my daughter, came into the restaurant weeping, and they were weeping when they were led away. I knew that, condemned to everlasting darkness, hunger and loss, they would weep on incessantly. They would never recover from their pain, and I would never recover from the memory of it. Even just reading that now, I have a lump in my throat.
Yeah, it was the same when I tried to read it to my wife as well. Yeah, it's really remarkable. So you said that his best books were witness statements, and this is an example of that. Just these scenes that he witnesses and transcribes.
I think his best books are witness statements. It's not the only thing a writer can do, but I think it's one of the best things a writer can do if they can do it well, because you're left with a picture which, again, if it's really well done, a picture that is indelible. One thing about books is, they're never subject to a new performance. You can reinterpret a symphony, you can reinterpret a film or a play. You can't reinterpret a book. The same things always happen from start to finish. But if you do it well enough, it's worth rereading and rereading and rereading. And I think that's really where Norman's incredible quality of prose comes in.
You said that one of his other capital themes was to see cultures as subjects and not objects.
Yes, I think that's right. He did try to, and I think succeeded in immersing himself, inserting himself into cultures and allowing them to act on him, rather than just going to a place and describing them. So that we've talked a lot about how he produced these glorious descriptions of the world. And that's sort of what he used to say, that he liked to produce these revealing little sketches of the world. But it's more than that. I think he was able to insert himself, I think, like a knife into those cultural situations, to understand them, to have them explained to him, and to bring them back to us in their reality, not as I say, not as an object, but as something living.
Yeah, he has a remarkable sense of capturing sort of the cultural continuities as well of a place, like the things that are just unchanging of the character of the people or the culture. So like going to Burma, I spent a month there in 2002 when it was still pretty closed off and a bit difficult to get to. And in reading his book, I mean, it's very little has changed. The same regions were inaccessible or difficult. The same modes of travel prevailed. People's character was very much the same. I remember meeting a guy in up in Mandalay was just as boring as well. I remember meeting a guy in some up around the Shan Highlands somewhere who was complaining about Rangoon that people were wearing trousers, and he didn't approve of this. You know, they weren't wearing longi anymore. So it's amazing how relevant some of his books still are from that perspective and capturing those core aspects. You said also that he was always catching these places on the verge of modernity. To quote you here, you said he was often called a lucky writer. Skirmishes, spectacles, wars seemed to find him. He seemed to have the right place, right time knack, but that wasn't the case. Rather, his ability was to see where things were happening, to hear where history's orchestra was tuning up, and then once there, to observe as closely as almost anybody could what would be likely to happen next. So where did this come from? Like he said himself, with Indochina, with Vietnam, anybody could have seen it coming, and the Americans should have seen it coming. Why did he see it coming when others didn't?
If I was special pleading on Norman's behalf that he had these supernatural power to predict what was going to happen, then I apologize now to the readers. But I think what happened was roughly what happened to me in Ukraine. Because I was interested in this country, first of all, extremely superficially, and then I actually got married there, and I would go back every summer. I saw when Putin invaded Georgia in 2008, and in fact, I wrote a piece about it saying, if we're not careful, Ukraine's going to be next. So, I think Norman's interest in the places that he went to, his interest peaked, and he was looking for subjects. So he did a huge amount of reading. He would say to himself, for example, I think Burma might be an interesting place to go to next. And then he would read about it, and then he would think, yes, definitely. And I think he did it with India, and he got it wrong, and the book was cancelled, and he did something else. So I think what he was doing was being interested in places and then thinking, well, what is likely to happen? He read the papers, he read magazines, and then he went. And I think he just had that knack of being interested. I think actually it's a truism about life. Now that I'm a bit older than I was, I kind of recognize that the more interested you are in a situation, the more you're likely to know what's going to happen. Be involved in a place, a country, a situation, and you will develop an instinct for the kind of things that are going to happen there.
And you also mentioned India. Seemed like there were quite a lot of trips that he did that didn't result in books or stories, that he would go there, invest a lot of time in reading and travel time, and then just decide, there's no story here. So we're not seeing that as well.
No, that's true. I mean, the interesting thing about, well, the two things I want to say about that. One is that, yes, he did that a lot, and it shows that he was conscientious and he did try, or he was careful, only to write about the situations and the places where he thought he would really get a good book out of it. So Guatemala, for example, although he wrote magazine pieces about Guatemala journalism, he never wrote the book that he intended to write about Guatemala because it defeated him. It was so complicated and so lengthy that he never got round to it. But the other thing is that we're talking about Norman, the adventurer, Norman, the writer about place. I'm not a great lover of the word travel writer, the phrase travel writer, but okay, I'll accept it. But he was, above all, he was an adventurer and a writer for me. But he saw himself as a novelist. For a very large part of his career, he saw himself as a novelist. The books of travel were the books that he wrote between novels because he knew that Cape would publish them. And what he really wanted was to be, and this is a bit flippant to say, but he would have loved to have been as famous a novelist as Graham Greene. Whereas I think what we've got, I'm sorry, Norman, but what we've got is that you are as great a writer as Graham Greene. You just do different things.
Lewis wrote more novels than books about travel, didn't he? It must be very close.
And it's very close. Don't pin me down on that. It's very close. Yeah. He wrote a lot of novels.
We said the failing in his fiction lies in his difficulty in processing emotions out of events. Like that, he wasn't able to go very deep into himself, so he couldn't imagine himself fully into the human interiors of other people.
Yes, I think that's right. If you think about the landscape of love and loss and desolation that you find in a Graham Greene novel, and passion, actually, those are all emotions that Greene himself felt. I mean, we think of him as a sort of quite a stiff upper lip Englishman, but he wasn't at all. And I think Norman just didn't have that sort of access to his own emotions. And so his travel writing instincts were at full tilt in his novels. So there are some fantastic descriptions, but in a funny way, the characters who are most alive in his writing are in his travel books.
Yeah, you had a great description of that. You said, at their best, Norman's compositions, his nonfiction and journalism, reveal his novelist instincts at full stretch, while at their best, his novels attract by an authenticity of action and a sense of reality as political commentary.
Yeah, I'd stand by that. I think that he had a talent for narrative, but it was this emotional problem. There was something stuck in him, and that goes back to his childhood. He had this very restricted, confined childhood.
So what do you think are his best novels? I mean, what would you recommend for a reader today?
Oh, I think The Volcanoes Above Us is a great novel. That's set in Guatemala. Funny enough, I also like the one he wrote late called A Suitable Case for Corruption, which is set in Libya. There are some duds, but those two are very good. And there is also one called The 10th Year of the Ship, which I love.
It's interesting that you mentioned his sort of personal guardedness being a barrier to his novels. He also wrote two volumes of memoir that seem very much constructed in a sense, is reconstructed his past. Like, how do you approach that as a biographer? How do his versions of his life differ from your versions, and how do you tackle that?
That's a good question. As a biographer, I approach it with a pinch of salt and with humor, because we know that when we write about ourselves, we want to tell the story that we want to tell. We don't necessarily want to tell another story which may have happened, but which perhaps reflects less well on us, or which is not as amusingly organized or as fascinating. And I think that Norman's challenge to me as a biographer was simply to check up on him and try and say, look, that isn't exactly what happened. This is what happened. But nevertheless, Norman's version has all the virtues, all the delights that you would expect. And I wouldn't, if I wrote an autobiography, I wouldn't expect it. Well, let me put it the other way around. I would expect to fictionalize it too in some sort of way, because I would want to tell a story about myself that was, or about my life rather, that I thought would be both interesting to me and interesting to the reader. And don't forget the reading here. Norman was very keen as a storyteller. He really enjoyed people's reactions to his work. He really liked to entertain in the most serious sense of that word, if you see what I mean.
I guess in a sense, we all have a version of our own narrative that we think is true or that we think motivated us at the time. And the story we tell ourselves, and it's obviously the story that you're going to tell others because you think that's what motivated the course of your life, often in a much more noble way than was actually the case. So I could see that in writing about his memoirs as well. You made a really brilliant observation, I thought. You said in his so-called autobiographies, Norman isn't writing about himself, but a new set of entries in this personal encyclopedia in which the past is a place as much as any of the places he has been to and written about. That's really interesting. This gave me a really great insight into a project I've been hoping to write about for a while and couldn't quite see a way in. The past as another country or a place that, I've been there, but a younger reader hasn't.
I think that's hugely important about Norman, that for him, the past becomes a country to visit, and then to apply the same skills to, and come back with a report about it, which is as entertaining as he can possibly make it. So in that sense, the volumes of memoir are as much travel books as the stories of place and journeys.
At many points in your book, you include passages that explain the biographer's dilemma, some of the things we were just talking about, the nature of the form and questions about the ability to come to any accurate understanding of the truth of a life. Why did you decide to take that approach?
Well, you've got to remember that I didn't want to write this book. I know it's 725 pages long, but I really only wrote it because I loved Norman so much, and I couldn't bear the thought of anybody else writing his biography. It's not because I think I'm the world's best biographer. I'd never written a biography before, but to me, one thing is the British, and to a certain extent, the Anglo-Saxon world loves a biography. To me, that world is slightly compromised by the way in which biographers write about their subjects. Perforce, they inevitably write about their subjects at the end of their life or when they're already dead. So the trajectory is set, and the biographer then tells that story. But what they don't get, unless they pay great attention to it while they're writing, is the sense of muddle, confusion, mess, unpredictability that assails us all on our journey through life to the final great defeat. And that is to me, that is a absolute necessity to describe that process by which something unknown becomes known. I look at Norman's notebooks and I see his tiny spidery writing, and the ink is starting to spread. And I'm thinking, wow, these don't look exactly the way they did the day he wrote them. But then what about the day before, when those events hadn't happened and those pages were empty? And that process, the process of becoming, is absolutely vital in a biography. And I just really wanted to try and get that across, because there was nothing to predict that Norman, out of Enfield, the pharmacist's son, who was a bookworm in the Carnegie Library, was going to turn into, I think, one of the great English writers of the last century.
So anyone interested in travel or writing about place absolutely must read Norman Lewis today. He's one of the greats, as you say. But why should the casual reader read him?
Oh, I think because picking up a book of Norman's and opening it, you will immediately be taken into a world you've never expected to enter. It's not just a lost domain because it's a place and an era that may have vanished. It's a way of seeing things that very few, only really great writers can provide. And to that extent, it's a bit like picking up a piece of treasure and finding that you own a piece of treasure.
So there's so much in your excellent biography that we haven't touched on. I mean, his intelligence gathering trips to Cuba for Ian Fleming, and his groundbreaking work on genocide in Brazil, his life with his crazy aunts in Wales. So I really hope listeners will run out and buy a copy. It's called Semi-Invisible Man. It's an incredibly good read. And then raid the shelves at Eland for some of the best of his writing. So Julian, thank you very much for your time. I really enjoyed this. It's fantastic to talk with you.
It's been a great pleasure. I've really enjoyed it too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.